Hey everybody, Eric Enge here. I'm the principal with the Digital Marketing Solutions Business Unit. With me today is my longtime friend and true industry rock star, Mr. Rand Fishkin. He is the founder of Moz, the founder and CEO of SparkToro, which will get some mention in today's discussion for sure. Let's see, author of Lost and Founder. Your head is slightly hiding the book there, Rand, behind you on the bookshelf.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, there you go.
He's a really heartfelt story of an entrepreneur's journey to, well, success, I'll say. Although I think it shares a lot of the real heartache of that whole experience, but a great book. But all of that said, thanks for coming in today, Rand.
Yeah, great to be with you, Eric, and great to have everyone joining us. I'm excited about this webinar. I think, I have been a researcher and a proponent of audience intelligence for a long time. In the last couple of years of my career, have been very focused on that specifically. But this is the first time I've ever given a formal presentation on the topic. And so, Eric, thank you so much for this invitation, and thanks to Perficient as well.
It's great. I think it's an awesome topic. It's a really important topic. The more you can understand about your customers and prospects, the better. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Just in general for the audience, please keep in mind that we are going to have a Q&A section at the end. If you have questions, queue them up. You can even submit them. We have people here helping accumulate those, and Rand and I will address them towards the end of the presentation. But with that, why don't we jump right into this first ever presentation on audience intelligence? And Rand, you're gonna cue this thing up or lead us off here.
Great. All right, so let's talk about audience intelligence and why this actually matters. So I'm gonna give some kind of an intro. Casey and I, my co-founder, and I have been doing a bunch of research into this and trying to understand, like, why is this so important? So audience, when we say audience, we don't just mean this one group of current customers, right? We actually mean a broader group of people, like potential customers, people you could reach who might become customers. They could be customer targets. And even broader than that, when we're using the term audience intelligence, we also mean your broader community and the media that impacts your audience, the people that have people and publications, sources of influence. Those could be big media outlets, right? This could be Bloomberg and Wall Street Journal and New York Times and Washington Post, or it could be tiny blog, industry trade publication, a podcast, a webinar, right? That like the one we're on right now. That's the broader community that impacts your potential customers and your current customers. And there's sort of an ecosystem that happens around this, right? You've got content and messaging that you produce, right? And hopefully that you are relatively in control of. As you get bigger, sometimes that can get out of your control too, in positive and negative ways. And then that impacts the public relations, the social media, the outreach that you do, all of your paid messaging, right? Which generally speaking, you do control. And that creates these relationships. It's sort of a connected web between, press, media, community sources of influence, your target audience, the people who are already customers and people who might be in the future. And from this group, right, you want to know, you need information so that you can do effective kinds of marketing, right? If I don't understand my audience, think classic SEO, right? Many people who are on this webinar are probably familiar with SEO, Perficient, and Eric and I obviously have a deep background in SEO. And in the SEO world, if you don't know what words and phrases your audience is searching for, you can't do good SEO. And if you don't understand the intent behind those searches, why did they search for them? What did they hope to get from that? You can't possibly serve them well. And so audience intelligence is designed to answer questions like these from current customers. What made our brand resonate with them? How do we earn their help evangelizing what we're doing? What would improve their experience? How do we keep their business or re-earn it in the future? What messages are effective to them? For potential customers, we might have questions like, how can we reach them? What could nudge them to become current customers? How can we earn their business that's different from how we earned our existing customers' business? Or is it just more of that? What's current perception? What are our competitors doing, right? Competitive intel. And then community and media, right? Which publications and people have influence? What are the topics and stories that might resonate? We use this gray group, right? The community and media group here to impact the potential customers and our current customers. And our current customers and potential customers also influence community and media, right? This is an ecosystem like we talked about. So what is audience intelligence? Like we understand the groups we're trying to get to. We know what our audience is. We understand basically why we want to reach them, why we have all these questions so we can do good marketing. But what is it? A succinct definition is useful, usable data about your customers, potential customers in community, right? Useful, usable data. So look, there's lots of data that personally I think, we'll get into personas and demographics and all that kind of stuff later. Sometimes I think it's really useful to have in certain senses, but right. So you have this useful, usable data. Some data is useful for some applications and not so useful for others. So I don't want to suggest that all of these data sources are what everyone needs to collect. You take the bits that matter to you for the strategies and tactics that you need to implement, right? If a data piece isn't useful, why bother getting it, right? What we want to do is start with a question. How are we going to reach this audience? How are we going to grow our market share? How are we going to talk about this new product launch? And then you say, well, I want to know more about the audience demographics, right? Things like income and education and age, family size, blah, blah, blah. Or maybe I want to know more about lifestyle, values, interests, attitudes. Personally, I don't find lifestyle and personality traits all that valuable, but I often find, for the people that I help at least, interests and attitudes really, really useful for the marketing, especially messaging side. Behavioral, right? Product usage. How are our existing customers using the product? How are potentially free users who aren't yet customers using it? What are their sources of influence? That's hugely useful to any marketer, of course. What social media do they use? What do they search for? Great for SEO. Where do they go? All that kinds of data. And there's like 3 ways or 4 ways to collect these types of data, right? Those are surveys, right? Which can collect things like express preferences. You're surveying your audience, you're saying, how do you feel about X? You can test messaging. Do you like this better or that better? Did this resonate with you? Does that resonate with you? And self-reported traits. Things like geography are self-reported traits that are pretty accurate. Things like behavior, less accurate, right? If you say, Eric, what podcast do you regularly subscribe to? You might give me 3. Those might be the 3 you listen to most, but they might not be, right? Interviews. I really like when I do surveys, I really like also doing some interviews of those people because I feel like it gives me the color and depth and personal connection that sits behind the data. So you can get to underlying values, market perceptions, why people say the things they do, product uses and frustrations. Analytics data, of course, every technical marketer gets data like this, and it can be incredibly valuable for helping to see the differences between people said they wanted X. When we actually offered X, they used Y in the product, right? And I've seen this many, many times that self-reported data is very different than real data usage, real areas of funnel friction. Why didn't you sign up? Well, it was price. Well, it turns out when we made the product checkout faster or allowed people to continue as a guest instead of having to create a login, they got through the funnel much faster. That suggests it wasn't just price. It was also ease of use, right? Those kinds of things. And then of course, behavioral data, right? So what are the percentage of people who have given attributes, who follow given sources, who use particular words and phrases? All very, very useful to understand a group in a way that you couldn't get from self-described data. We'll talk about some of that in a bit. All right, some core components. So I really, really recommend that if you are going to understand your audience, you want to have real relationships with real people in that audience. So these are some people who happen to be in my, this is Will Reynolds, right, the founder of Seer Interactive, and Ross Simmons, who's an independent marketer up in Canada. And both Ross and Will, at least Will's teams, use the product that Casey and I made, SparkToro. But I also brought up this slide to illustrate something. Anyone notice something strange about this slide? It is true, we are at the Philadelphia Eagles Stadium in Philadelphia. This is pre-coronavirus, obviously. That's correct. Out of the 47,000 people pictured, Rand Fishkin is the only one not wearing an Eagles jersey in the entire crowd. This is illustrative of the fact that I did not understand my audience. And so I did not behave correctly, and I got a lot of looks from people who, if I hadn't been with other Eagles fans, might have been very skeptical. What is this person who's clearly going to brunch doing at an Eagles game? But I do highly recommend real relationships. I think that makes a huge difference in how you understand your audience. You also want statistically significant data. If anytime you are gathering data, you need not just a big enough group, but you need to understand, right? When you collect data, there's variance in the data, and that variance will indicate to you how large an audience you want. So if you've ever seen like election polling data from anywhere, it'll say, you know, confidence interval plus or minus 2%, right? And obviously in the 2016 presidential election in the United States, the plus or minus 2% turned out to be very significant, right? It meant that a lot of poll predictions ended up being incorrect, but it was still within the margin of error. And so you are looking for the same thing in your data. You want margin of error that is relatively low so that you can have high confidence in your data. You also need a well-structured, measurable funnel. I like to think about a funnel in these 4 steps, right? Awareness, how do people hear about my brand? First visit, how do they get to the website? Returning visits, how do they come back? Why? And then conversion, how do they make something happen on the site? Sign up with an email address, try a free tool, buy something, whatever it is. And then the market-wide, last one, market-wide behavioral data sources, right? So we'll talk about some of these in the future. Verto Analytics here is one that I'm actually newly investigating, but this is sort of competitive, overarching market data. And I love this type of data because it lets me get to real behavior of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of real users in ways that is directly observable rather than self-reported. All right.
All right.
Eric,
so I'm going to get over the next few slides here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why all of this matters now. But let's flip a slide ahead here earlier. But so why does this matter now? And it's a really good question. And well, it's not even just now. This matters all the time, right? You always need this kind of information, but the current situation we have with the COVID-19 pandemic is a spectacular example of why you want to be able to get behavioral data really quickly and rapidly. There's such huge changes. Some examples here of queries that are up and down. There's so many more. I mean, did you ever hear about virtual happy hours prior to this? Yet in my family, we have them happening 2 different game nights a week with friends that we didn't even get together with prior to the COVID-19 on a regular basis, and we'll probably keep doing them after it's long gone. There we go. So, I mean, the reality is with all of this, your product and marketing strategies need to keep up. So I'm just going to do that when I need a little bit more. So you might need to adapt what you're doing with your products to meet new needs, emerging needs. We've seen people do that. I gave the example of virtual happy hours. Pricing. There's a lot of businesses that are under a lot of stress right now. So we've seen a lot of companies offering better payment terms as another important kind of thing to do. And then change your positioning a little bit. So maybe your product was already capable of doing the thing that they're looking for now, but if you don't change your positioning and tell the customer that it's able to do that. So I'm going to stay with my example. You have the ability to do these virtual happy hour kinds of things, but you just didn't call it that before. And that's just adapting your positioning to the market condition. So let's go to the next one. And then the tactics too. The channels might change, right? So you really have a situation where behavior in all these areas can change in a significant way due to the market conditions.
Do you see that desktop, right? Desktop is on the rise for the first time in like 15 years.
Yes,
mobile
it is
shrinking.
Absolutely, because people aren't out and about, so they're not doing it on their phone. They're sitting at their desk. And by the way, yes, the larger screen and the larger keyboard do still matter. And it is a perfect example of something that changed dramatically. So, and the reality of, since we are using the pandemic as an example here, I mean, obviously people have had to, companies had to lay people off and cut their marketing budget and cut their spend, and the people have really had to do that. But I really do think a lot of people did it too quickly without actually being thoughtful and seeing if there was a way to reposition themselves. And I've seen some companies do that where I thought they actually had the opportunity to do something different. Let's go to the next one, please. So let's talk about some traditional marketing approaches to understanding your audience. So Rand, you mentioned earlier how much you love persona. So we're gonna get to talk about that in a second. But first of all, who is your target audience and what makes them tick? So are you trying to, if you're selling party supplies, you're probably addressing people who are extroverted in nature. Whereas if you're selling video games, you're probably addressing an audience that's introverted in nature. And that's a pretty simplistic way. You also have level of income and many different kinds of preferences that can define what your audience is. And then also, just like, what market are we really in? I always love the famous example of, I'm going way back in history here, turn of the 1900s, when the railroads ultimately got hugely damaged and went out of business. It's because they thought of themselves as being in the railroad business and not the transportation business. So they weren't able to morph with changing times. And if they had understood the changing behaviors of the consumer set, they might have been able to adapt more quickly. And then, how do you address that audience? And that, that's your brand promise. Now you know who you're trying to address and what business you're in. But how do you get across what makes you special and different? Are you the cheap option? Are you the expensive option? Are you the best value? And there's many other ways of talking about this. And how do you showcase these differences? It's all great to know who your target audience is, what businesses you're in, and what makes you different. But if you don't do a good job of getting that across, right, you could, really just still fail because of that. So it's really important to get that messaging down and know how to get that out to the audience. And then ultimately, what's the experience that you want to deliver, right? Are you a high customer service or self-service? I mean, that's a very simplistic way of talking about it, but also just sort of the personality you have, the tone of voice. I always love the example of there's a restaurant here in Boston where the experience you go for is that the wait staff is hostile to you, and people do it because it's funny, and it's sort of a reverse what you would normally want kind of experience that people thrive in, and it's sort of it actually works for them that they go through out of their way to deliver this seemingly negative experience.
Well, perfect example. So the slides we're presenting, you remember a few days ago, I sent over like a version of the slide deck, and Victoria wrote back and was like, those fonts you sent me are really fun, but that is not the Perficient brand. And so, right, we're changing because the tone didn't suggest the right sort of brand and branding that Perficient has. And you can almost feel it, right? If you look down at the bottom right-hand corner of the slide, like the two logos suggest almost the same thing. Look, Eric is wearing, right, like gray and red, and Rand's wearing like all these different crazy colors. Eric has a single background. Rand has like all these crazy toys behind him, right? Different tones, different brands. Obviously, Perficient is very B2B and full service, and SparkToro is very self-service. So exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, perfect example. So, but let's go ahead and step ahead with slides. So here, I just wanted to give an example of two different fictitious brands, and these slides actually are credited to Google. I should emphasize that. We'll get that added before we send the slides out or make the slides available to people. But so imagine that your target customer audience are business travelers, and they need high reliability, and they need to make sure that they're going to get there. They want to be very confident. They also want you to respect their space and allow them to do what they want to do on the plane. So you could imagine that your brand name, your company name could be Important Airlines. And the messaging is, yeah, it's very important. We'll get there, get you there. You can depend on us. It's going to happen. You're going to make your meeting on time. And yeah, actually, it actually notes Wally Grill, Google I/O. Sorry, I didn't see the note there. So the credit is there. Good. And you should watch that video if you're interested in this kind of stuff, by the way. But so this is one kind of thing an airline could be. And if we look at what that would mean for how the airline would put together its persona, you might imagine them adopting the persona like a butler, which is, very solid, confident, an expert in the things that they know, very reliable. You know exactly what to expect, very straightforward kind of personality. And also just your interactions with them are very safe. It's, it's like not going to be risque or anything along those lines. But in contrast, let's look at a second airline. And this one is Millennial Airlines. And the messaging is very different. It's sort of a bold, hip, very active kind of brand. They're very, they're friendly. You could expect to enjoy your flight. And the sort of the theme of this one, it's an awesome day to fly. So very, very different kind of messaging. And the persona for that, excuse me, would be very different too. So, this person is very fun-loving. You can see it in their fashion and their style and the way they behave. And so this aspect of personas is kind of looking at it from the company side. But what they're trying to do with that, what I'm trying to do with these examples is now think about how do we apply all this stuff that we talk about to think about what we do with our business to reach our target audience. And that's a big part of, I think, what we try to get to when we think about audience intelligence or persona modeling or things of that kind. So let's flip ahead. And then people also talk about customer journey mapping. This is another common thing to talk about. Rand talked about the funnel a little bit earlier, and you can imagine the progression that people have through a purchase funnel, from discovering your brand to learning more to considering it seriously, to conversion, and it's just different names that people give for these different steps. You need to understand what your audience is and how they're thinking in each of those stages of the funnel, so you can target your content, your channels, and your messaging to each one of those segments. But I will mention for fun before going on here, Rand has serious concerns about persona modeling, and maybe one or more of our clever audience members will ask a challenging question in that regard when we get there. Anyway, back to you, Rand.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so oops, yeah, there we go. Great. So we know that these forms of data, right? These behavioral data, self-report, right? Survey data, analytics data, all of it can be applied in two ways: strategy and tactics. So I want to spend a little time on that strategy and application piece, right? On the strategy side, Eric, you talked about this a little with your persona modeling. There's positioning data, right? Who is our customer target, right? Who are we going after? What is the unique value proposition that we have for them? And how do we position that versus competition? And I really like, if you haven't read it already, I love April Dunford's book on positioning called Obviously Awesome. And in Obviously Awesome, she talks about how your competition is not just direct competitors, it's any solution that solves the same problem for your customer target, right? And then you're positioning yourself against those. And obviously this data is hugely helpful in determining how you should do that positioning, right? In informing that. It also helps on the promotion side. What's our product story? Where are we going to amplify this message? What's our path to return? It's super helpful in your funnel, right? Figuring out your acquisition process, your visit to conversion. What does that experience look like? How does the step through work? Is it high touch, like we talked about self-service versus full service? How do we engage and enable retention and repeat purchases? And then it's also about your marketing approach, the channels you're going to use for acquisition, for retention, for messaging and promotion, the team you need to build in-house entirely, small, big budget, small budget, organic, paid, outsourced, right? Agencies and consultants versus completely in-house, and hacks and flywheels, right? Like what's the flywheel we're trying to build, the thing that scales with decreasing friction in our marketing, and what are the points of friction we encounter that we need to apply hacks to get over those barriers. It's also true that you need this for tactical stuff. So if you are not a CMO, not a VP of marketing, not someone who's setting strategy, but rather you're in the trenches doing the tactics, doing the work on the advertising side, right? This intelligence, audience intelligence, tells you where exactly, not just where broadly, but where exactly to do your placement, how to do your copy and messaging, how to refine that, if a message isn't working, what should I attempt in order to reach people, right? Calls to action, budget allocation. On content and SEO, this is how you figure out, your keyword targeting is a behavioral data source, right? It comes from Google or from a third-party SEO tool or from a clickstream data source, right? And it tells you it gives you exactly that insight. It helps tell you topics and focus, helps tell you media types you should use. Is video working with my audience? Is podcast working with my audience? Are webinars good for my audience? If you're selling bone broth to consumers, webinar? Probably not. But video? Maybe. GIF recipes? Oh, heck yeah, right? Perfect, right? Same with distribution channels. User experience, right? Tells you which patterns people are familiar with so that you can pattern match in your product. We experience this a bunch when we're building SparkToro and trying to figure out like, well, what patterns are people familiar with and not familiar with? Can we show them a diagram like this? Will people understand a Venn diagram? Okay, our audience is going to understand a Venn diagram. That's a great way to go. Other audiences, not so much. Featured elements, nav labels, visual design. This is I think, why a lot of user experience and UI designers love persona modeling. And CRO, right? My funnel structure, my calls to action, my nurturing, how do I get people through? We'll talk about a couple tools and resources. In fact, Eric, I think you're going to take a couple, and then I'll take a couple.
You got it. So first, we're going to talk about SurveyMonkey. So it's a great tool. Well, Typeform, SurveyMonkey, and Google Forms, all three. So there's this idea of real querying and getting real user information that Rand spoke about earlier. Survey 100 customers, great. If you could do 1,000, great. Hey, even 10, just so you can get some information and real dialogue. These are three great tools. Actually, here at Perficient, we're fans of all three. So
I do have one suggestion here, which is what I love about Typeform is I tend to, if I have simple questions, I tend to get a higher response rate when I use Typeform versus the other two. I think it's just like a user experience thing. It's like easier and funner, more fun to get through. And so I tend to get about 20% higher response rate on Typeform. I don't know if you've seen similar, but.
Yeah, no, that's a good input. So great. And then also I want to talk a little bit about SimilarWeb. We love SimilarWeb as a tool. It's something that we use very actively here within Perficient get really great insights on competitive marketplace data, competitive data, user engagement data that you can get. I think one of the things that makes SimilarWeb particularly unique is the size of the audience sample they have, which is a relatively large sample. In fact, the last I knew, it's the largest sample of the tools.
I'm a big fan of SimilarWeb as well. I really like being able to see specifically the sources of referral. So if you sort of scroll down on this page, this is free, by the way. If you go to SimilarWeb's site, you can see this data, and then they have a pro version as well. But I also find it's not as useful as it used to be, but Facebook Audience Insights for your pages, and when you use Facebook's Audience Builder inside the Facebook ad system, you can get some data on sort of sizes of different audiences relative to one another. I find Facebook's numbers around these a little frustrating. Like, I don't actually think there's 6.6 million American users of Facebook who care about market research. That's way, way, way too high. However, comparing market research versus search engine optimization can give me a sense of the sizes of those two different audiences. That's what I like using the audience builder for. And you can get some basic demographics, right? Geography, gender, et cetera. Oops. Next, all right, great. LinkedIn also has this really cool feature. I don't know if folks have seen this, but when you share content on LinkedIn, you can't see this competitively, although you are welcome to ask your friends and colleagues when they share content for this data. But when you share content on your LinkedIn, you can see data about the people who viewed it and shared it like this. It'll show you the companies that they work for. It'll show you the titles that they have. It'll show you location, a few other data points if you click show more. This is super useful if you are in B2B audience intelligence gathering, especially around those. Remember, I showed the like blue tiny circle of your current customers, but then that bigger circle of potential customers, and even bigger circle of audience.
We are close to the end here. You want to just give a quick wrap up before we take
Sure. So the final tool that we were going to mention here and talk about is SparkToro, which obviously I have a vested interest in. So I won't be overly promotional, but you can run free searches. But the idea with SparkToro is that you can get behavioral data at scale across tens of millions of profiles, similar to what SimilarWeb does, but not clickstream data, right? So SimilarWeb is essentially behavioral across what do people click and where do they visit on the web and where do they go next and previously. And SparkToro is more about behavioral data gathered from social and web profiles. So looking at what do people share, engage with, talk about, follow, right? And so we can show things like what are the influential sources of influence for hospital administrators, right? Something a lot of folks are trying to, an audience that many people are trying to reach right now, or healthcare administrators. And then you can see the websites that they visit, the social accounts they follow, YouTube channels they pay attention to, et cetera, et cetera. And it provides a sort of detailed behavioral data at scale. This is a unique data type. I'm not actually aware of another company that provides this, so I don't have a good competitive source of this intelligence. The best I could offer is what we saw some people substituting, which is kind of the cyber stalking at scale, where you go collect a large number of your audience's social and web profiles, and then you go crawl those and manually build sort of big spreadsheets to get this type of data about how they describe themselves and what they visit, what they follow, what they engage with. So with that being said, I think we've got some great questions and fewer slide challenges.
Yeah, and hopefully no more audio and video challenges. But before we take the questions, just want to mention that just my completely uncompensated comment. I've been playing with SparkToro. I've seen some really great, interesting insights from it. We had some things that we were trying to do, exploring an opportunity with a client around media in local markets, and we're able to rapidly get some really interesting and cool insights on the best places to spend that media. Lots of interesting applications for it. So I'm very excited about the tool, Rand. Looking forward to doing much more with it.
Yeah, it's been exciting to see how people are using it.
Yeah. So question here from Kate Thomas. What are your favorite tools or methods for measuring friction in the funnel that Rand showed in his slide?
Great question, Kate. So let's see. So there's two kinds of funnel friction. The one that I talked about is friction in your marketing funnel, meaning you sort of are having challenges getting from maybe earning initial attention to getting a repeat visit, or from getting a repeat visit to getting someone to actually convert, right? And when you see those types of challenges, there's the best process that I've found is to try and segment the audiences that are performing well versus the ones that are not performing well. And sometimes that's based on source. Sometimes it's based on content they have or have not seen or engaged with. Sometimes it's based on who they are or profile data. And that last one is really tricky to come up with, but I do have an awesome tool for you. I just talked to the team yesterday at Full Contact, and they have this remarkable sort of profile connecting identity platform, so that you can connect up data from banks and credit cards, from mobile user IDs, from social sources or social profiles, from email, all those things, right? And so if you have that, like any one of those data points, you can give it to Full Contact and they'll fill out all the rest and help give you this holistic view of visitors or email database or social followers or whatever you've got for them. And that can help you to segment that. That's been a really good one.
Yeah, and there's actually a way to use just simple analytics to do some of this too, right? So you can see what pages people are bouncing off of, and Absolutely. You can actually tie it back to campaign sources. So if you ran a campaign at one particular target market audience, or one target audience of your segment, and then you tried it on a different target audience, you could actually, and ran it through into the same funnel, you could see who's engaging better with that messaging versus not. So there's some of these things that you could do that are fairly straightforward.
The 90-day cookie thing has really frustrated a ton of those efforts, right? Because you have much faster expiring cookies than you used to, and there's and privacy issues and stuff. But one thing I do really like doing is just nudging people to log in somehow, right? Because if you capture an email address or a login, now you don't have to just rely on the visitor analytics, and you can see that longer lifespan. So like at Moz, people logged in to leave comments, or they logged in to give a thumbs up on a post or whatever it was. And thus we could see a bunch more about them, like, hey, it was highly predictive of if you visited 3 or more of these kinds of blog posts that you would eventually become a customer. So that great funnel analysis tip there.
Yeah, and then this one looks like it's for you specifically, Rand. Out of all the feedback and usage you've monitored so far, this is from Jeremy Galante, what has been the most surprising for your team?
Oh man, okay. This is going to be slightly depressing, but I think very indicative of something that's probably going on for a lot of people. And I like to be very transparent about this stuff. So at the end of February, we sent our first early access group. I think I mentioned this to you, Eric, right? That we had about 20,000 people on our early access email list. We sent the first group of those, about 3,000. At the end of February, and we had a very high conversion rate. Like Casey and I were celebrating. We were like, wow, we're gonna have a great launch. And then of course, March hit and the pandemic hit, and our conversion rates of the same group, right, that same group of 20,000 people, just another random set of 3,000 emails, performed at about 40% that conversion rate 2 weeks later, and then about 10% that conversion rate by the end of March. So pretty frustrating to see that impact. But I know that's true for many folks. If you're in B2B, a ton of people have had their corporate cards pulled. A ton of people have had their finance teams come to them and basically say like, hey, all new spending is frozen or has to get approved. So that was one of the most surprising things we saw.
And then I've got to do one last question here because I think we're kind of at time, if I'm not mistaken. Megan Jensen wants to know, how important is at least a rudimentary understanding of psychology and or behavioral economics in determining the nudges that will affect your audience's online behavior? Any books or talks you recommend? You're about to get some books.
I know. I'm pulling up my books because what a great question. Happened to be looking at a bookshelf.
He wasn't ignoring the question, Megan. He was actually had already read it.
Exactly. So I really like both of these. Dan Ariely's Predictably Irrational. He also wrote another one called Upside of Irrationality that I've got over there that I liked a lot. And then Nudge, I think, is another brilliant book for that sort of psychology of persuasion. There's also a book by Professor Robert Cialdini, which I think is called Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion. Highly recommend that.
Yeah, and I've seen Robert Cialdini speak before, and he's a great speaker, really very educational. So there's a lot of insight there. And I'm gonna sneak one more question in here, and I apologize, Esther, if I mispronounce your last name. Esther Licori, and the question is, what is your experience with AI-based platforms for audience intelligence?
Okay, so I did a little bit of competitive research when we were starting SparkToro into this space, and what I found was two things to be true. One, almost no one who says they're an AI-based platform is actually using any form of artificial intelligence. Some are using machine learning in an attempt to build in missing components or predict things like sentiment or attributes of an audience. I think big consumer brands probably find those pretty valuable. My market, right, at least for SparkToro, tends to be more SMB, more mid-market, more agencies and consultants, and more detailed tactical types of applications versus like Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy, trying to figure out where should we launch our next big liquor brand in South America, right? And so my use cases for that, they didn't resonate with me as much. But I think if you are a big brand attempting to get those consumer insights from some of the ones that call themselves AI but are mostly machine learning can be useful.
Yeah, just be careful. It's things like AI and even machine learning are buzz phrases that people like to use out there. And you know, artificial intelligence is a phrase that people like to use for anything almost that involves the computer. And machine learning is what most people are actually doing, which is a very powerful and useful sort of thing. But it's just a way of trying to create an equation, if you will, and I'm being literal here. This is what it does, creates an equation to fit the existing data so that you can predict where other data points will sit along the curve. And that's effectively what you're doing with machine learning. It can be very, very useful, but it's, you still need to feed it real hardcore information. And the more of it you give it, the better. All right. So, Victoria, if I'm not mistaken, I believe we're at an end for the webinar. So, Rand, thank you so much for joining us today. A pleasure as always.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
No, absolutely. And to the audience, thank you all. Thanks for attending. Our sincere apologies for, network trouble.
I would say the average amount of network trouble on a webinar. We didn't go way up. Like, if you build a data plot of all webinars, I think we fall squarely in the curve. No, thank you everyone for joining. If you have follow-ups, Eric, you are on Twitter at Stone Temple, if I'm not mistaken. And
that's correct.
I'm at Rand Fish, so you can reach us there.
All right. Thank you.